Story number 1.
The road signs made no sense. Daniel had been driving for nearly an hour, trying to find his way back to the highway, but every turn only led him deeper into the back roads. The gas station clerk had given him directions, but they weren't adding up. He checked his phone. No signal. His gas tank was running low. If he didn't find the main road soon, he'd be stranded. The night felt endless. No houses, no passing cars. Just a winding road surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around him. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, the fog creeping along the ground like fingers reaching for his tires. Up ahead, a road sign appeared. Daniel squinted. That wasn't right. That wasn't the road the clerk had mentioned. He must have made a wrong turn. His grip tightened on the wheel. He needed to turn around, but as he glanced in his rearview mirror, his breath caught in his throat. There was a figure standing in the middle of the road behind him. Motionless. Too tall. Daniel's stomach clenched. Had he passed someone? He didn't remember seeing anyone on the road. He swallowed hard and faced forward again. He would keep driving. Find the highway. Get the hell out of here. He pressed the gas pedal, but his fingers trembled slightly on the wheel. A few miles later, another sign appeared. Black Hollow Road. Daniel blinked. No, that wasn't possible. He had been driving straight. He hadn't turned. He glanced at his fuel gauge, dangerously low now. He needed to stop. He needed help. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A small house sat just off the road, dimly lit by an old porch light. Relief flooded through him. He pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. He stepped out cautiously, the night air unnervingly still. The house looked old, but someone had to live here. He knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. A soft creak. The door swung open on its own. A rush of cold air hit him, sending a shiver down his spine. The inside of the house was dark. Hello? He called. Silence. Something felt wrong. Then, in the corner of the room, something moved. Daniel's breath hitched. A figure sat in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim porch light. He took a step back, his pulse thudding in his ears. Then the whisper came, low, raspy. You're not supposed to be here. Daniel turned and bolted. He sprinted back to his car, heart hammering, and yanked the door open. But then he froze. His fuel gauge now read full. And on his passenger seat, an old Polaroid photograph. His hands trembled as he picked it up. It was a picture of him, standing in front of this house. Only in the photo, there was something standing behind him, a tall, shadowy figure. Daniel's breath turned shallow. He turned his key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the driveway, gravel kicking up behind him. He didn't care where he was going, he just had to get away. The road stretched on. Then the sign appeared again. Black Hollow Road. Daniel's vision blurred. No. This wasn't happening. His pulse pounded as he looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was there. Closer now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The whisper came again, curling into his ears. You're lost. The headlights flickered. The road vanished into darkness. The last thing Daniel heard was the whisper echoing from the void, and you won't be found. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The road stretched on, swallowed by darkness. Michael had been driving for hours, his GPS useless in the dead zone of backcountry roads. What was supposed to be a shortcut had turned into a winding maze of unmarked intersections and endless trees. The gas gauge was dipping toward empty. His phone sat on the passenger seat, showing no signal in the corner. The clock read 11:47 p.m. He exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. There had to be a gas station or a town up ahead. Then through the fog, headlights appeared in the distance, faint but approaching. Relief flooded through him. He flashed his high beams, hoping to flag them down. The other car didn't respond. It just kept coming. Michael slowed as the vehicle passed. It was an old sedan, its windows impossibly dark. He caught a glimpse of a figure in the driver's seat, but their face was hidden. Then, just as the car disappeared into the rearview mirror, his own headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed for a moment before everything returned to normal. A chill crept up his spine. Maybe it was just his imagination or exhaustion playing tricks on him. He shook his head and kept driving. Minutes later, a green road sign loomed ahead. Black Hollow, 3 miles. His stomach tightened. That wasn't the town he was supposed to be heading toward. Had he made a wrong turn? He sighed, scanning for a place to pull over and check his map. Then, up ahead, the same car. The old sedan. It was parked on the shoulder, hazard lights off, engine running. Michael slowed instinctively. Was it the same one? Had it turned around? As he passed, he glanced through the driver's window. A figure sat inside, completely still. Then, it turned its head toward him. Michael's blood ran cold. The driver had no face, just smooth, pale skin where features should have been. Michael slammed his foot on the gas, his heart hammering. The trees blurred past. He didn't know where he was going anymore. He just had to get away. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He checked the rearview mirror. The sedan was gone. The road stretched empty behind him. His hands were shaking. He needed to pull over. He needed to think. Then, through the fog, a gas station. Relief hit him like a wave. The neon, open sign flickered above the door. The place looked old, almost abandoned, but it was a chance to get directions, maybe even gas. He pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped out. The night air was thick, heavy. The station was eerily quiet. No attendant, no other cars, just the hum of the flickering lights. Michael hesitated, then pushed open the glass door. A bell jingled. Inside, the shelves were stocked, but everything was covered in dust. The air smelled stale. At the counter, an old rotary phone sat next to the register. He stepped forward, about to call out. Then he saw it. An old Polaroid photo on the counter, his stomach twisted. It was a picture of his car. Tonight, his breath hitched. His car was visible through the store window, parked exactly as he had left it. Someone had taken this picture. Just as realization hit, the bell above the door jingled. Michael froze. He hadn't touched it. A whisper curled through the air. "You're lost." His pulse pounded. Slowly, he turned toward the door. Through the glass, under the flickering light, someone stood by his car. Watching. Not moving. Just waiting. Michael didn't hesitate. He bolted for the back of the store, searching for another exit. The hallway was dark, silent. Then, the whisper came again. Right behind him. He spun, his breath ragged. The store was empty. His hands trembled as he backed away, reaching blindly for a door. His fingers found the handle, and he pushed through. Cold night air hit him. He was outside. He ran for his car, yanking the door open. His keys. Where were his keys? His breath hitched. Then on the dashboard, another Polaroid. It was of him, standing inside the gas station. Michael's vision blurred. He grabbed his keys from the passenger seat, hands shaking. The whisper came one last time. Soft. Lingering. You won't find your way back. The lights of the station flickered out. Darkness swallowed everything, and Michael knew, deep in his bones, he was never getting out. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The road was empty, stretching ahead like a tunnel into darkness. Rachel gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white. The only sound was the steady hum of her car engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees lining the narrow highway. She checked her phone again. No signal. "Come on, not now," she muttered. She had been driving for over an hour, trying to find the right turnoff to the remote rental cabin her boyfriend Mark had booked for the weekend. Her GPS had stopped working miles ago, and the last road sign she had passed was too faded to read. She was lost, and the later it got, the more uneasy she felt. The headlights illuminated a fork in the road. There had been no mention of this in the directions Mark had given her. Left or right? Rachel hesitated, her gut telling her to turn around and retrace her route. But the thought of driving another hour in the opposite direction with the gas gauge dipping toward empty made her stomach twist. "Right," she whispered to herself, making the turn. The road narrowed, the trees pressing in closer. The pavement turned to gravel, the sound crunching beneath her tires. A dense fog had started to roll in, swallowing the road behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. For a split second, she thought she saw something standing in the middle of the road. A figure. Tall, thin, unmoving. She hit the brakes, her heart hammering. The red glow of her taillights illuminated only the empty stretch of road behind her. There was nothing there. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "You're just tired, Rach," she told herself. "You're imagining things." She exhaled sharply and kept driving. The fog thickened, wrapping around the car like a living thing. The further she drove, the more unfamiliar everything became. The road twisted unnaturally, leading her deeper into an area she was sure wasn't on any map. Then she saw it. A wooden sign. half buried in the overgrown brush. "Welcome to Black Hole." Rachel's stomach clenched. There had been no mention of any town along her route. She slowed the car, her headlights illuminating a narrow path leading off the road. At the end of it, she could make out what looked like a house, a lone structure standing against the night. The cabin? She pulled onto the path, her tires crunching over dead leaves. The house was old, its wooden exterior weathered and cracked. A single light flickered weakly in one of the front windows. Something felt wrong. She hesitated, gripping the wheel. But she had to be close to the cabin Mark had booked. Maybe this was it? Maybe the GPS had screwed up and taken her down an alternate route? She turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and stepped out. The cold air bit at her skin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. Blood. She swallowed hard, her breath visible in the frigid air. The front door was slightly ajar. A dim light flickered inside, casting long shadows on the warped floorboards. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. A faint creaking sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. Rachel took a step back. Nope. Not doing this. She turned back toward her car and froze. The fog had swallowed the road completely. The car's outline was barely visible through the mist, and standing just beyond it, half hidden by the swirling white haze, was the figure. It was closer now. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't move. The figure didn't make a sound, but she could feel it watching her. Its shape was just barely human. Too tall, too thin, its limbs slightly wrong, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her body screamed at her to run. Then, without warning, the light inside the house flickered and went out. Rachel bolted for the car. Her hands trembled as she yanked open the door and slammed it shut behind her, locking it in one fluid motion. She fumbled with the keys, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine sputtered. "Come on! Come on!" she begged, turning the key again. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Right outside the car. Lost. Rachel's blood turned to ice. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The figure stood directly behind the car, inches from the trunk. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but darkness. The whisper came again, curling through the air like smoke. Lost. The car roared to life. Rachel slammed her foot on the gas. The tires spun against the gravel before finally gripping, launching the car forward. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching as she sped away, disappearing into the fog. She drove blindly, the road twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Her headlights barely pierced the thick mist. She kept her foot on the gas, heart racing, refusing to stop for anything. Then, a road sign. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Rachel's stomach lurched. No, she had just left this place. She had been driving for miles. How was she back here? She gritted her teeth, gripping the wheel. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This isn't real." But the road ahead remained unchanged. And then she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing along the roadside, motionless, faceless, watching. The whispers surrounded her, filling the car, filling her head. "Lost," Rachel screamed. She floored the gas, barreling past the figures, refusing to look at them. The road stretched on endlessly. The fog thickened. The whispers grew louder. Her vision blurred. And then, nothing. Darkness. Rachel woke to the sound of knocking. Her eyes fluttered open. Morning light streamed through the windshield. A man in a reflective vest stood outside her car, peering in. "You okay, miss?" Rachel sat up with a jolt. Her car was parked on the side of a normal-looking highway. The fog was gone. The trees were normal. She looked around, dazed. "Where am I?" "Just outside Black Hollow," the man said. "You were parked here all night? You lost or something?" Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned to look at her rearview mirror. A single handprint was pressed against the fogged-up glass. Long, thin. Rachel didn't answer. She started the car and drove away. As she sped down the highway, the wind carried a whisper through the air. Soft. Lingering. Lost. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The night was dark and silent, the moon barely visible behind a thick veil of clouds. Emily had been walking for hours. She had missed the last bus back to her apartment after a late dinner with friends. The area she was in was unfamiliar, with winding roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. She was lost, the bright city lights far behind her, and the small rural town she had wandered into felt like a different world. Her phone had died an hour ago. She could still hear the occasional rustle of branches in the wind, but the sounds of the busy streets felt like a distant memory. All around her, the dense trees loomed, their shadows stretching like fingers. She tried to call a cab, but the signal was spotty at best, and she had no idea how far she was from civilization. As she walked, her mind kept playing tricks on her. Every crack of a twig, every shift in the air, made her heart race. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, hoping it would shield her from the chill of the night. The road seemed to be leading her deeper into the woods, and Emily couldn't help but feel the growing weight of her isolation. Then, in the distance, she saw something, a dim light flickering through the trees. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to call to her like a beacon of hope. With a sigh of relief, Emily started to walk faster, her pace quickening as she drew closer. The light was coming from a small house tucked between the trees, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Relieved that she had found some form of civilization, Emily approached the house. She hesitated for a moment, standing at the end of the gravel path before knocking softly on the door. No response. She knocked again, a little harder this time, but still nothing. She was about to turn away when the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, her face lined with age but still kind. Her eyes were a pale blue, almost transparent in the moonlight. "Lost, are you?" the woman asked in a soft, raspy voice. Emily nodded, her heart still racing. "Yes. I've been walking for hours, and I'm not sure where I am." The old woman studied her for a moment, her gaze sharp despite her frailty. "You should be careful, dear. There are places in these woods that are not meant for wandering." She stepped aside, gesturing for Emily to come in. "Come in, child. You must be exhausted." Grateful, Emily stepped inside. The house smelled of lavender and old wood, a comforting scent that made her feel strangely at ease. The living room was small, with a fire crackling in the hearth. A large armchair sat in front of the fire, and the room was filled with shelves of books and trinkets that seemed to tell the stories of a life lived fully. The woman led her to the chair and gestured for her to sit. "Take a rest. I'll make you some tea." Emily sank into the chair, her muscles finally relaxing as the warmth of the fire seeped into her bones. She was grateful to be out of the cold, but a strange feeling of unease began to creep over her. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. There are places in these woods that are not meant for wandering. What did she mean by that? The woman returned with a steaming cup of tea, which she handed to Emily with a soft smile. "Drink, dear. It will help." Emily took the cup, inhaling the steam before taking a cautious sip. The tea was warm and calming, and she could feel herself starting to relax. The fire crackled in the hearth, the sound oddly soothing. But just as she was beginning to let her guard down, a noise from the other room startled her. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at the woman, who didn't seem to notice. The sound continued, growing louder, and Emily's eyes darted toward the door leading to the other room. "Don't mind that," the woman said, her voice calm, but with an edge of something else. "It's just the house settling." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scraping sound persisted, almost as if it was deliberate, coming closer and closer. She glanced at the old woman, but she was still sitting quietly by the fire, her expression blank. The door to the other room creaked open, and Emily's heart stopped. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were dragging something heavy across the floor. "Who's that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling despite herself. The old woman didn't answer immediately. Her lips curled into a thin smile. "That's my husband," she said, her voice soft. "He's not very talkative, but he's harmless." The man stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing through the silence. He was wearing an old suit, tattered at the edges, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes were hollow, and when he looked at Emily, she felt a chill run through her. "Why is he dragging that?" Emily whispered, her gaze shifting to the dark shape the man was pulling behind him. It looked like an old, heavy trunk, but something about it seemed wrong. The old woman's smile faded, and she stood slowly, her movements stiff. "Don't worry about that," she said in a voice that was now colder than before. "You've had a long journey. Rest. The night is full of strange things. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the warmth of the tea did nothing to calm her. The man's gaze never left her, and the scraping noise continued, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone in the house. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The old woman paused, her eyes narrowing. She didn't answer right away, as if considering her words carefully. "We're just trying to help, dear. Everyone who comes here needs help one way or another." Before Emily could ask anything more, the man dropped the trunk with a heavy thud. The sound reverberated through the room, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. The trunk creaked open, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness inside. But then something moved. Something in the shape of a human body, twisted and distorted. The figure inside the trunk groaned, a low, guttural sound that made Emily's blood run cold. The man's hand shot out, and with a strength that defied his frail appearance, he dragged the body from the trunk and set it upright. The figure was barely recognizable, its skin pulled tight over bones, its eyes wide and empty. It was a woman, her mouth hanging open in an eternal scream. Emily jumped to her feet, her heart racing. She backed away, her hands trembling. "What is that? What are you doing?" The old woman's voice was calm, almost detached. "She's just another one who wandered too far into the woods. We try to help them, but sometimes—" She trailed off, her eyes darkening. "Sometimes it's too late." The man reached out, his cold fingers brushing Emily's arm, and she recoiled in terror. The woman's voice echoed in her mind. "There are places in these woods that are not meant for wandering." In that moment, Emily understood. The door slammed shut behind her, and the last thing she heard was the sound of the trunk scraping across the floor again as it was opened for someone else. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, flanked on both sides by towering trees that swayed gently in the cold night breeze. Ethan checked his phone again. No signal. His car sat on the side of the road, hood propped open, steam rising from the overheated engine. "Great," he muttered under his breath. He had been on his way to his girlfriend's cabin, deep in the woods, when his car had started sputtering. A few miles back, he had passed a small gas station, the only sign of life he had seen for the last hour. It was either wait for someone to drive by or hike back and hope the place was still open. Grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment, he locked the car and started walking. His footsteps crunched against the gravel shoulder, the night eerily silent aside from the occasional chirp of unseen insects. The deeper he walked into the darkness, the more uneasy he felt. After 20 minutes, he began to doubt himself. The gas station should have been closer, shouldn't it? He was sure he had only passed it a few miles back. Checking his phone again, still no signal. Then he noticed something odd. The road had changed. It no longer looked familiar. The trees on the side seemed denser, their gnarled roots breaking through the cracked pavement. Had he taken a wrong turn? But that was impossible. There had been no turns. A faint rustling came from the woods. He stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The sound was soft, almost deliberate, like footsteps matching his own. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and the thick trunks of trees stretching endlessly into darkness. He swallowed hard and kept walking, quickening his pace. But the farther he went, the less familiar everything became. It was as if the road had stretched itself into something unnatural. The gas station was nowhere in sight. And then he saw it. Up ahead, dimly lit by the moonlight, was his car. Ethan stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. No, that wasn't possible. He had been walking straight. There was no way he had circled back. He turned, looking back the way he had come. The road stretched behind him, dark and empty. His footprints were nowhere to be seen in the gravel. Dread coiled in his stomach. Slowly, he walked back to his car, placing a trembling hand on the hood. It was still warm. The engine was still steaming, as if no time had passed at all. He glanced at his phone, still no signal. Something was very wrong. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shape stood at the tree line, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. His breath hitched. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs slightly too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The shadows clung to it like a second skin. And though he couldn't make out any facial features, he felt its gaze locked onto him. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Then it took a step forward. Ethan stumbled backward, fumbling with his car keys. His hands trembled so violently that he dropped them. They clattered to the ground. The figure took another step. A whisper, soft as the wind, slithered through the night. Lost. Ethan gasped, scrambling for his keys. His fingers closed around them, and he yanked open the car door, throwing himself inside and slamming the lock. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached for the ignition. The car wouldn't start. The whisper came again. Lost. He forced himself to look up. The figure was standing right outside his window. Up close, it was worse. Its skin, or what passed as skin, was stretched tight over an emaciated frame, its mouth an unnatural slit that widened as if grinning. But the eyes, there were no eyes, just hollow, black voids. Ethan screamed. The thing slammed its hand against the glass, the impact rattling the car. The window began to frost over, breath from the other side visible in the cold air. Lost, it repeated, a slow, drawn-out hiss. The car rocked violently, as if unseen hands were pushing it. Ethan turned the key frantically. The engine roared to life. Without hesitation, he slammed the car into gear and peeled out, tires screeching against the asphalt. The road stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar. The trees blurred past as he drove faster and faster, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But he didn't have to, because the whisper followed him, faint, just beneath the roar of the engine. Lost. Ethan pressed harder on the gas. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst. The road seemed endless, stretching into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went black. He woke up to the sound of knocking. His eyes fluttered open. Sunlight streamed through the windshield. A man in a gas station uniform stood outside, peering in. "You all right, buddy?" the man asked. "You've been sitting here all night." Ethan sat up with a jolt. His car was parked in front of the gas station, the very place he had been trying to reach. His heart pounded as he looked around. The road was normal. The trees weren't as dense. Everything looked real. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then he saw it. A single handprint on the outside of his fogged-up window. A long, thin handprint. Ethan didn't stay to ask questions. He gunned the engine and drove away, never once looking back. But as he sped down the road, a whisper curled through the wind. Soft, lingering, lost. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the forest in a cloak of darkness. Kate had been walking for hours. The streetlights had long disappeared behind her, and now she was surrounded only by the rustling of the wind in the trees. The familiar paths she'd taken as a child were now lost to her, swallowed by the vast, dense woods. She had been visiting her grandmother's house, which sat on the outskirts of town, but now she found herself completely disoriented. She didn't remember where she'd turned wrong, but she had taken the wrong path and ended up far off course. She checked her phone once more, but the screen only flickered and then went black. The battery had died hours ago. A creeping panic began to form in her chest. She had no idea which way to go. The quiet of the forest was suffocating. The sound of distant wildlife made her skin crawl. She called out, her voice trembling, but all she heard in return was the eerie silence of the woods. Kate stopped walking and leaned against a large tree, breathing heavily. She needed to think. She needed to figure out where she was. Maybe there was someone nearby who could help. She had to keep moving. As she continued, she noticed something strange, a flicker of light in the distance. It wasn't a street light, but it seemed too consistent to be a campfire. Kate's heart skipped. Maybe it was a house. Maybe someone was there who could help her find her way back. She pushed forward, stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The closer she got, the more distinct the light became. It was coming from a small house, tucked away between the trees, its window glowing warmly. Relieved, Kate hurried toward it, her pace quickening. She reached the porch and knocked gently at first, then louder when there was no response. She waited, her breath clouding in the cold air. Finally, the door creaked open, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, her face pale under the dim light from inside. There was an odd stillness about her, a calm that didn't quite match the anxious feeling Kate had in the pit of her stomach. "You're lost, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but knowing. Kate nodded quickly. her words catching in her throat. "I've been walking for hours. I don't know where I am. Can you help me?" The woman stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Come in, dear. You must be freezing. It's dangerous out there, especially at night." Kate hesitated, but felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She stepped inside, and the warmth of the house immediately enveloped her. The smell of wood smoke and something faintly floral filled the air, and the crackling fire in the hearth was soothing. The woman closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. "Take a seat by the fire," she said. "I'll make you some tea." Kate sat down on an armchair near the fire, trying to calm her racing heart. She watched the woman move through the room, her movements slow and deliberate. There were odd paintings hanging on the walls, landscapes that looked familiar, but not quite right. Some of the trees seemed to be reaching toward the viewer, and the skies were perpetually overcast. The more Kate looked at them, the more unsettled she felt. The woman returned with a steaming mug of tea and handed it to Kate. She wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "Thank you," Kate murmured, taking a cautious sip. The tea was fragrant and soothing, but something in the back of her mind whispered that it wasn't entirely what it seemed. "Where are you from, dear?" the woman asked, sitting down across from her. "What brought you out here tonight?" Kate explained about her visit to her grandmother's house and how she had gotten lost on her way back. The woman nodded, as if she had heard this story many times before. "You know," the woman said slowly, "people often get lost in these woods. It's easy to lose your way." Her pale eyes locked onto Kate's, her voice suddenly colder. "There's something about this place, something people don't understand." Kate shifted uneasily in her chair. "What do you mean?" The woman's smile was thin, almost sad. "Some paths in these woods aren't meant to be traveled. Some things that wander out here don't come back the same." Kate's throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" Before the woman could answer, a noise came from the back of the house, soft at first, like a creak in the floorboards, then louder, a dragging sound. Kate froze. The woman's expression didn't change. "It's just the house settling," she said, but there was an edge to her voice now. She stood up abruptly. "I'll get you some more tea. Just sit and relax." Kate didn't want to stay here any longer. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't explain why. She glanced around the room, her gaze falling on the strange paintings again. Her eyes were drawn to one in particular, a dark, foggy landscape with a single path leading off into the distance. But the trees in the painting, they looked like they were moving. She quickly turned her attention back to the fire, her stomach turning. A small, cold feeling spread through her chest. The dragging sound grew louder. The woman returned with another cup of tea, but she didn't look quite the same. Her movements were slower, deliberate, almost mechanical. Kate couldn't help but notice that the woman's eyes were vacant, her expression somehow more distant. "I think I need to go," Kate said, standing up suddenly. "Thank you for the tea, but I really need to get home." The woman didn't respond at first. She simply watched Kate with those pale, unblinking eyes. "Are you sure you want to leave? It's dangerous out there." "I'll be fine," Kate said, forcing herself to sound confident. "I'll find my way." But as she stepped toward the door, the woman blocked her path. "I'm afraid you're not going anywhere, dear," she said softly. "You should have listened when I told you. This place, it keeps you here." Kate's heart raced. She tried to push past the woman, but her hand shot out, cold and firm, gripping Kate's wrist. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have followed the path." Kate's breath caught in her throat. She looked over the woman's shoulder and saw something in the dim light, a shadow standing in the doorway of the next room. It was tall, its form twisted, and its eyes, they weren't human. The shadow moved, and Kate's blood turned to ice. With a surge of panic, Kate yanked her wrist free and bolted toward the door, slamming it open. She ran out into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light from the house flickered behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Kate ran through the woods, the trees and shadows closing in on her, the feeling of being watched so overwhelming she thought she would collapse from fear. The distant scraping sound followed her, growing louder, like something dragging behind her. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, until she stumbled out onto the main road, gasping for air, the sound of the forest gone, but the image of the twisted figure still burned in her mind. She had made it out. She didn't know how, but she had. The next day, she tried to find the house again to show someone what she had seen, but the path was gone. The woods were empty, as if the house had never been there. Kate would never forget that night, and she would never again wander into those woods. Story the end.